He ate everything, including the proof. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Tell me, where are you watching from today? Your comments always make this better. You can't always predict which knock on the door will ruin a perfectly fine Tuesday, but I'll say this. When the doorbell rang that morning, I didn't expect it to come wrapped in a linen suit, reeking of civility and something faintly spicy I couldn't quite name. I was 2 sips into my second cup of coffee, feet up on the corner of my desk, pretending to be productively reviewing last week's expenses when Fritz came into the office with a face that looked like he'd been asked to serve squirrel for lunch. "There is a man at the door," he said, with the kind of weight you usually reserve for court summons or grave robbers. "He has not given his name, but he insists Mr. Wolfe will want to see him." That earned a blink. "Did he use the magic words?" Fritz looked puzzled. "Magic? Personal friend of Mr. Wolfe's," I clarified, "or something equally imaginary. He said only that he comes on behalf of an appetite Mr. Wolfe will understand." I set the cup down. That was either the start of a very weird poetry reading or someone who knew Wolfe better than most strangers dared. Wolfe was, as usual, in the plant rooms. I knocked once, because you never knock twice unless you want to be skinned by eyebrows alone, and got his permission to speak. "There's a visitor downstairs," I said, standing just outside the door to avoid the tropical humidity wafting out. "Won't give his name, but he says you'll understand his appetite." There was a pause, the sound of misting, and then Wolfe's voice, gravelly and even. "Show him in. No more than 10 minutes. That was generous. For a man who wouldn't cross his threshold for a president, Wolfe's willingness to admit an anonymous guest on an empty stomach was, frankly, historical. "10 minutes later, the guest was seated in the red armchair, dabbing his brow with a handkerchief that looked like it cost more than my last 3 suits combined. He had the kind of face that always looked halfway to a smirk, and fingers too clean for honest work. The linen suit was immaculate. His shoes could have been a mirror for vanity itself. He introduced himself finally as Clive Baird, a name that meant as much to me as a crossword clue without any boxes. Wolfe took him in with a lazy glance, lounging in his oversized chair like a throne-bound tortoise. "Speak, Mr. Baird," Wolfe said. "Your time is brief and your bait was intriguing." Baird smiled. "Mr. Wolfe, I've read your record. I know you don't leave this house. I also know you detest involvement in petty crime. What I bring you is neither petty nor ordinary." Wolfe closed his eyes, which is Wolfe's way of showing both insult and restraint. "If it involves blood, guns, or hysterics, kindly remove it from my sight." "None of those," Baird said, folding his hands. "What I have is a theft, a very particular, very personal theft. The item in question is gone, consumed." "Consumed?" Wolfe opened one eye. "Yes, eaten." That got me. "You're telling us someone stole something? By eating it?" "Exactly." Wolfe made a low sound, something between a sigh and a rumble. "That is grotesque." "And," Baird added, "deliberate." It was done at a private dinner at my home, in full view of 4 other guests, and yet no one saw anything. Wolfe's eyes opened fully now. "The item?" "A handwritten, signed recipe. Original, Auguste Escoffier's velouté garbure, gifted to my grandfather by the chef himself. Worthless to most, but priceless to me. It vanished during dessert. Someone took it from my library, and later that evening, it was eaten." I frowned. "You're sure?" The crumbs were in the fireplace, and my guest, a food columnist with a flair for performance, had a suspiciously full stomach and a guilty tongue. Wolfe's brow twitched. "You invited 5 guests to a meal, one of whom destroyed a historical artifact by ingestion, and you want me to unearth which glutton committed the act?" "Precisely." Wolfe reached for the beer Fritz had placed on the side table and sipped without comment. Then he spoke. "You'll send me their names, their professions, a seating chart, a menu, and a detailed timeline of the evening's progression." "Done. Also, each of them will visit me here. I will question them. If any of them object, withdraw your commission." Baird smiled thinly. "They'll come. None of them can resist a stage, or a chance to declare innocence in dramatic fashion." Wolfe looked over at me. "Archie, show Mr. Baird out. Then clear my morning. This is contemptible but interesting." "You're taking the case?" Wolfe closed his eyes again. Someone committed a symbolic act of consumption, a vulgar desecration of culinary history. "Yes, I am regrettably intrigued." Baird stood, bowed slightly, and left behind a sealed envelope with names and addresses written in loopy, pretentious script. When the door closed, Wolfe leaned back with a grunt. "Bring me Escoffier's memoirs, and inform Mr. Panzer he may be needed." "Already," Wolfe muttered, "there is something off." The theft was not about appetite, it was about annihilation. A performance I went to get the books. And just like that, our Tuesday was ruined, in the most Wolfe-appropriate way possible. Fritz was not pleased. That, in itself, wasn't newsworthy. Fritz disapproved of most things that disrupted the sanctity of Nero Wolfe's brownstone. But when I told him that not one but 5 guests would be visiting for private interviews, each of whom was a suspect in a case involving the ceremonial devouring of culinary history, his eyebrows almost relocated north permanently. "I assume," he said, quietly affronted, "that they will not be fed." "That would defeat the purpose, wouldn't it?" I replied. "We wouldn't want them confusing our archives with the appetizer course." He didn't laugh. He almost never does when it comes to food. Back in the office, Wolfe had positioned himself deeper into his chair, a fat copy of Memories of My Life by Escoffier opened on his lap. His index finger traced a slow path down the page like a man following the trail of a ghost. "Archie," he said without looking up, "you will arrange them, one by one, starting tomorrow, mid-morning. I want the first here by 10. You want names alphabetically, by culinary crime potential. By schedule, yours and theirs. I want no overlap, no eavesdropping, no theater." "That might be tricky," I said. "These are professional drama magnets. One of them hosts a weekly show on how to taste wine without swallowing. Another rates the sound of soufflés rising." Wolfe growled. "Degenerates." "Baird's notes are, let's say, expressive," I added, flipping through the envelope he'd left. "You've got your 5 suspects. Here's the cast of Culinary Carnage." I read them aloud, one by one, while Wolfe listened, eyes closed again. Dr. Hugo Veen, culinary psychologist, writes a blog about how food triggers suppressed memory. Former guest lecturer at Columbia. Lorna Creel, gastronomic memoirist, famous for a book called Flavors of My Affairs. Likes to dine, reminisce, and overshare. Martin Gable, food columnist, former chef, loudmouth, allegedly once stabbed a critic with a rosemary sprig. Yvonne Tyler, curator of the edible history exhibit at the Cooper Museum. Real highbrow, once baked the Magna Carta out of cinnamon. Bradley Kind, Baird's nephew, influencer, posts pictures of his meals with captions like broth goals and soup, but make it sexy. Wolfe made a noise like his liver had just failed. A nest of lunatics. Mr. Baird keeps vile company. "Maybe he's just playing to the crowd," I said, seeing as the stolen recipe was edible and sentimental. He claims someone burned and ate it during dessert. "I do not believe," Wolfe muttered, "that anyone dines in earnest with such people. One endures them." The next day, the first guest showed up 10 minutes late, wearing a scarf that looked like it had been ironed by angels and a scent that could knock a cactus unconscious. Dr. Hugo Veillen had a soft voice, soft hands, and a hard stare. He sank into the red chair like a psychiatrist preparing for a role reversal. "I'm told," he began, with all the subtlety of a court summons, "that you suspect one of us consumed Clive's little treasure." Wolfe didn't flinch. "I suspect that someone found satisfaction in destroying something sacred to our host." "And you think it was me?" "I think nothing. Yet, you will speak." And he did. At length. About Clive's obsession with culinary lineage, about the pompous way he displayed the recipe, framed, no less, in a locked glass case in his library. About how Clive insisted on reciting its history to every guest like it was the Gettysburg Address in soup form. Vein found it tedious, exploitative, and emotionally manipulative. "Food is memory," he said at one point. "But Clive eats memory to feel important. He hoards significance. That recipe meant more to him as a possession than a story." Wolfe listened, his eyes half-lidded, fingers templed. "And you? What does destruction mean to you?" Vein smiled. "Purification." I led him out and made a mental note to never accept a dinner invitation from anyone who'd read Freud. The second suspect came an hour later and made herself at home faster than a cat in a warm laundry basket. Lorna Creel swept into the room with a waft of vanilla and ink, wearing a turquoise shawl and the kind of expression that suggested she'd already fictionalized everyone in the building for her next memoir. "I told Clive," she began, "that keeping that recipe behind glass was a betrayal of the dish itself. Recipes want to live. They want to breathe. That thing deserved to be smeared with butter and buried in flour, not locked up like a hostage." Wolfe made a noise like a tectonic plate shifting. "Did you destroy it, Miss Creel?" he asked. She laughed. "Darling, I'm dramatic, not destructive. Besides, I was already halfway into a port-induced fog when dessert arrived. If anyone had eaten a parchment scroll, I'd have written it down." "What was your impression," Wolfe said, "of Mr. Baird's nephew?" "Bradley. Please. He's a brand with eyebrows. He took 47 pictures of the cheese course. 47. I counted." She left a copy of her latest book, Spoon Me Gently, on the hall table on her way out. Fritz picked it up with 2 fingers and disposed of it like evidence. By noon, Wolfe was already irritable. "These people," he said, "are not suspects. They are symptoms. Baird invited attention addicts to an edible shrine and is surprised someone defiled it." "Pfui," I shrugged. "Still, someone crossed a line. Someone destroyed something sacred to him. That counts." "Does it?" Wolfe's tone darkened. "Or is this a melodrama disguised as grief? Perhaps the recipe was never truly valued, only flaunted." The afternoon suspect was Martin Gable, and he practically bounced into the office with the arrogance of a man who'd once sautéed a paralegal live on TV. "Let me guess," he said before I even shut the door. "Clive wants his precious scroll back." "Ridiculous. The man uses it like a business card." "You disliked him," Wolfe said. "I disliked his hypocrisy. He claims reverence for Escoffier, but he can't poach an egg without help. He once served me a cassoulet so undercooked I thought it would file a lawsuit." "Where were you during dessert?" "Arguing with Yvonne about the color of consommé and watching Bradley livestream the ice cream. It's possible someone ate the recipe. But honestly, I thought it got lost in the decor. The man's library is a shrine to overstatement." When he left, Wolfe stayed quiet for a long moment. "They are circling around it," he said finally. "Each is giving the same shape with different shadows. They resented Baird's possession. They disrespected the object. But they all imply the same thing. Someone had to break the illusion." I nodded. "You think it was deliberate sabotage?" "I think," he replied, "that it was performance. Consumption as annihilation, a gesture meant to humiliate. Still think it wasn't a murder? Wolfe closed his eyes. Archie, it was worse. It was a public insult dressed in digestion. Call Saul. I want the fireplace examined. And prepare for tomorrow. The last 2 suspects will be the loudest. I marked the appointments in my notebook and headed for the kitchen, where Fritz was violently tenderizing veal in a way that suggested he might want to use it on our guest list instead. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought had begun to simmer. Who benefits from a crime no one can undo? And who, among that flamboyant 5, had enough ego to chew history just to be noticed? The next morning brought the kind of overcast sky that made the brownstone feel like it was suspended in a cloud, the light outside refusing to commit. Wolfe hadn't left his chair for anything but a perfunctory check on his orchids, and Fritz had adopted the silence of a man preserving his sanity through soup stock. Saul Panzer had already called in. He'd been to Baird's townhouse early that morning, examined the fireplace, and found what he described as enough evidence to indict a toast. A small fragment of charred parchment was recovered. Scorched at the edges, but enough, Saul said, to confirm the thing had been handwritten in fountain pen, probably on heavy cream stock. It hadn't burned cleanly. Someone had wanted the act to be visible, symbolic, not merely disposal, display. Wolfe nodded once when I relayed that. He hadn't needed the proof to know what had happened. He'd only needed the detail to confirm his suspicion. The crime wasn't concealment. It was spectacle. At 10 sharp, our next guest arrived. Yvonne Taille was the kind of woman who looked like she'd been sculpted by a committee. Hair in a severe silver coil, black jacket cinched too tightly, glasses perched on her nose like they were judging you. She stepped into the office like it was a courtroom and examined the furnishings as if grading them. "Thank you for receiving me, Mr. Wolfe," she said. Her voice clipped. "I've long admired your insistence on intellectual order." "Pooh," Wolfe muttered. "Admiration is a poor mask for motive." "Sit." She did, stiffly, like the chair was liable to bite. "I'm not accustomed to being accused of theatrical vandalism," she began. "You are not being accused," Wolfe said flatly. "You are being questioned. Sit in that distinction and speak." Yvonne drew herself up. Clive's so-called treasure was a farce, a piece of culinary theater masquerading as scholarship. He displayed it like a relic, not as a record. Escoffier was a chef, not a prophet. Recipes live in practice, not in frames. Yet you didn't object publicly. I was his guest. Did you leave the library during dessert? Number wine was precisely where I'd been the entire meal. At the table, enduring Bradley's live commentary and Lorna's posturing. Did you see anyone else leave? Martin excused himself briefly. Said he needed a palate reset, which, coming from him, could mean anything from mint to a minor crime. "And the recipe," Wolfe said, "was displayed during the meal?" "It was kept in the library. Clive brought it out to show, as he always does. A little sermon before the main course." "Did he pass it around?" Numbery held it like a museum docent guarding a Ming vase. "Did he ever mention making a copy?" He claimed it was irreplaceable, which I suppose it now is. She stood without being asked. "I came out of courtesy, Mr. Wolfe. But if this becomes a public matter, I will not have my reputation dragged into someone else's appetite for melodrama." As I escorted her out, she passed Bradley Kind in the hall. He was already halfway into a phone conversation and took the opportunity to document the moment. "Hey, followers," he said into the phone camera, pouting slightly. "Guess where I am? That's right, the legendary Nero Wolfe's home, solving the case of the soup scroll scandal. I'll post a full breakdown later. Smash like if you think I'm innocent." He breezed into the office, all teeth and angles, wearing a jacket designed to look wrinkled in an expensive way. He had that glow people get when they've never truly faced consequences. "Wow," he said, spinning slowly. "This room is like, so intense. Can I get a photo?" No, Wolfe said. Bradley plopped into the red chair like it owed him rent. Okay, so Uncle Clive thinks someone ate his little chef's scroll. Honestly? Sounds like performance art. Did you take it? Wolfe asked. Whoa, straight to it, huh? He grinned. No, sir. I wouldn't eat paper. It's got, like, gluten. You are gluten intolerant. Number, I'm brand intolerant. That kind of thing doesn't align with my public image. You live-streamed the dinner, Wolfe said. Parts of it. Did your stream capture anyone leaving the room? He blinked. I don't know. I was mostly filming the cheese board. Had a ring light set up and everything. Post it, Wolfe said. Privately. To Mr. Goodwin. Bradley looked delighted. So I'm helping the investigation. Number, you are complying. There's a difference. When he left, after 2 attempts at selfies with the front door, I returned to find Wolfe tapping his fingers against the arm of the chair, deep in his version of brooding. It's less pacing and more pressure. They are all deflecting, he said. All 5. Each disdains Baird's performance. Each one thinks the recipe was a symbol of fraudulence, but only one committed an act to erase it. The timing's tight, I said. No one admits leaving the room but Gable, and the recipe went missing during dessert. Wolfe opened his eyes. The act required solitude and drama. It was not theft, it was ritual. Gable had opportunity, but Yvonne had ideology. Veen had psychology, Lorna had flair, and Bradley had followers. Wolfe made a sound of distaste. They are all credible, and yet none is likely. The act was too quiet for Gable, too crude for Yvonne, too final for Veen, too mundane for Lorna, and too analog for Bradley. Then we're stuck. No, Wolfe said. We are poised. I leaned back, waiting for the lightning bolt. Archie, Wolfe said, call Mr. Baird. Tell him we are convening a meeting. All 5 guests. My office, tomorrow evening. To what end? To tell them what happened, Wolfe said calmly. To explain who destroyed his sacred scroll, and why. I stared. You already know. I do. But Wolfe closed his eyes again. There was only ever one person who truly needed it gone, who had motive, message, and method. The others merely watched it burn. I stood, notebook in hand, mentally preparing for the most dangerous act of any Wolfe case. The roundup. And Archie, Wolfe added, you will also invite Saul. Quietly. I suspect our culprit may not enjoy exposure. Outside, the clouds were finally breaking, but the brownstone felt 10 degrees colder. Whatever Wolfe saw, he saw it whole, and someone, who thought they'd eaten the evidence clean, was about to find out that nothing digests in Wolfe's office without leaving a trace. The invitations went out before the sun dipped behind the row houses. 1 by phone, 2 by text, and 1, Lorna's, by personal visit, because she claimed not to trust technology with affairs of accusation. They all agreed, with varying degrees of curiosity and disdain, to gather at Wolfe's office by 7 the following evening. Saul Panza confirmed he'd be there, silent as a shadow, posted just outside the office door in case the night's truth-telling needed reinforcement. Wolfe spent the hours prior in uncharacteristic silence, not with orchids, not even with Fritz's trial run of celeriac gratin, but alone in the office, eyes closed, fingertips pressed together, thinking. When he thinks like that, it's best not to speak unless spoken to. So I busied myself with checking the chairs, laying out fresh pads, sharpening pencils we wouldn't use, and wondering who among our guests would panic first. By 6:45, Fritz had set out iced water and a discreet tray of napkins. There would be no food. Not tonight. Wolfe had made that clear. Food, he said, had been the medium of this crime, not its motive. To serve it would be vulgar. They began arriving with the awkwardness of people who prefer to be the center of attention but now suspect they may instead be the subject of dissection. First was Veen, smooth and unreadable, followed by Lorna, who kissed the air beside Wolfe's chair and called the evening a literary feast. Martin Gable arrived third, chewing gum like it owed him money. Yvonne came fourth, her spine straight enough to serve as a coat rack. And last, precisely at 7, was Bradley Kind, filming himself walking through the door with a breathless, "Okay, fam, things are getting real." Wolfe allowed them to settle before speaking. He didn't rise. He never did. But his presence filled the room like steam in a kettle. His eyes flicked from face to face until even Gable stopped shifting in his seat. "You are here," Wolfe began, "because one of you committed an act of deliberate obliteration. You erased something your host treasured, not out of hunger, but out of hubris. You consumed, publicly and symbolically, a piece of culinary history. You did this not for taste or theft, but to make a point." There was a ripple. Breaths held, glances exchanged, but no one spoke yet. "You did not destroy the recipe for its content," Wolfe continued. "You destroyed it because you could not stand its meaning, that it represented something Clive Baird had that you did not. Permanence." "I beg your pardon," Yvonne started, but Wolfe lifted a finger and she silenced. "You all belittled it," he said. "Some of you called it vanity, some a relic, a propriedad. Yet you all spoke of it, obsessed over it, which means you gave it weight. You resented it because it endured. Unlike careers, reputations, or trends, that recipe was a fixed star in Baird's universe. So one of you decided to extinguish it." Wolfe looked at Veen. "You called it manipulative memory." At Lorna. "You said it deserved to be buried in flour." At Gable. "You dismissed it as a business card." At Yvonne. "You scoffed at its framing." At Bradley. "You turned it into clickbait." "Still," Wolfe said, "only one of you left the room. Only one had time to access the library, remove the recipe from its case, and destroy it with theatrical precision." Gable sat forward. "Yeah, I left for a second." "So what? I didn't even touch the thing. I went to the kitchen. Ask Clive." "No," Wolfe said. "You went to the library, because the door was slightly ajar when Bradley's live feed caught it. Frame 229, timestamp 8:12 p.m. Bradley blinked. "Wait, you watched the footage?" "Saul did," I said. "He's more patient with ring lights and shaky narration." "But even then," Wolfe said, "Gable did not take the recipe. It was still there, on the sideboard, when Yvonne walked in at 8:14 to fetch her scarf. She told us that, didn't you, Miss Tyler?" Yvonne's lips thinned. "Yes, it was still there." "So," Wolfe said, "the crime occurred after that. During dessert, while the others were engaged in a spirited debate about the color of consommé. That's when the thief slipped away, not to steal, but to consume. The fireplace was used to finish the act, not begin it. Saul found the half-burnt wrapper in the grate." "A wrapper?" Lorna frowned. "Yes," Wolfe said, "because the parchment had been wrapped in a linen napkin from the table. Folded tightly, it concealed the item during transit and absorbed most of the grease." "Yes, I said grease. Because our culprit didn't eat it dry. That would have been too desperate." Bradley squinted. "So, like, they seasoned it?" "Correct. Fritz examined the napkin. There were traces of olive oil and lemon rind, meaning someone marinated it. Someone planned to eat it before they even arrived." The silence was heavy now. Even Gable wasn't chewing. "You see," Wolfe said, voice sharpening, "this was not improvisation. It was orchestration. Someone wanted to stage a destruction, one Clive would feel but never prove. And only one of you has the flair, the motive, and the opportunity to pull it off with applause." His eyes settled finally on Lorna. She blinked. "Me?" "Yes, Miss Creel. You who preach that recipes should breathe. who resent any written record that isn't accompanied by a broken heart and a sunset. You brought your own napkin, one monogrammed LC. You carried it in your handbag, your emergency shawl bag, which you left unattended when you went to powder your nose. You slipped the recipe into it then, hid it at your side, and returned to dessert. Lorna stared at him. That's absurd. Fritz found the matching napkin in your coat pocket before you arrived tonight. He checked after I made my guess. It still smells faintly of lemon oil and ash. She stood suddenly, the chair scraping back. This is ridiculous. You have no proof I ate anything. You bragged earlier that if anyone had done so, you would have written it down. And you did. You couldn't resist. I stepped forward, reaching into the desk drawer, and pulled out the manuscript Wolfe had instructed me to request quietly from her publisher that morning. The first pages of her upcoming book. Swallowed Secrets. I opened it to the dedication page and read aloud. To the ones who keep stories, locked in glass. This one I ate for you. Lorna's face didn't fall. It crumbled. Her mouth opened, closed, and finally froze in a crooked smile. It was a stupid recipe, she whispered. He didn't even use it, just waved it around like a flag. I wanted him to feel emptiness. You succeeded, Wolfe said calmly. You hurt him. Quietly. Publicly. Precisely. She didn't resist as Saul stepped into the room. She didn't argue. She just sighed. Tell Clive, she said, that maybe now he'll write his own recipes. She left without another word. The others followed, dazed. Bradley had stopped filming. When the door shut behind them, Wolfe exhaled deeply. Fritz, he called, dinner. Then to me, that woman ate history to make a metaphor. And did she? No, Wolfe said. She made a scene. There is a difference. He closed his eyes and let silence settle over the brownstone again, as it always did when justice had been served. Not with punishment, but precision. Fritz brought in dinner on the dot of 8. Veal medallions with truffle cream, braised endive, and the quiet understanding that conversation was not required. Wolfe remained in his chair, unmoved, yet I could tell the case had left residue in the room. The kind that lingers, not because it's unresolved, but because it revealed something Wolfe found particularly distasteful. The desecration of meaning for the sake of spectacle. He cut his meat slowly, deliberately, eyes lowered, not with fatigue, but with reflection. I'd seen that look before. It usually meant the case was closed, but the damage wasn't. After dinner, we returned to the office, where the air still held the ghost of confrontation. I poured myself a short brandy. Wolfe didn't take one. That alone told me his mind hadn't moved on. You're brooding, I said, settling back across from him. Nonsense, he replied. You haven't commented on the veal. It was adequate. Which, from him, meant it was excellent, but irrelevant. I let a beat pass. She wanted attention, you know. Of course, Wolfe said, but not merely that. Miss Creel has spent her life turning intimacy into entertainment. She devours privacy. What she did was not an act of gluttony, Archie. It was her most elaborate metaphor yet. She said it was about making Baird feel emptiness. Number for it was about proving she could alter his reality. She wanted to demonstrate that meaning, any meaning, is only as real as others allow it to be. That if enough people mock something, even reverence can be reduced to ash. I took another sip. You're more philosophical than usual. He didn't look at me. Because this crime offended more than intellect. It offended the sanctity of things kept. You liked the idea of that recipe, didn't you? It was a record, Wolfe said, of process and perfection. A relic not for its age, but for its precision. And she... He stopped. Then, she consumed it as commentary. That is vulgar. We let the silence do its work. A soft knock at the door surprised both of us. Wolfe frowned. Fritz never knocked unless the house was on fire or the balance of the universe was about to be tampered with again. I answered. It wasn't Fritz. It was Clive Baird. He stood there in the hallway, coat half unbuttoned, tie askew, a man not used to showing up uninvited or late, but doing both. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but in the way grief shrinks a person. I won't stay, he said quickly. I heard what happened. Come in, Wolfe said without rising. You may sit. He didn't. He stepped into the office like it was the edge of a cliff and stood, hands clasped in front of him. So it was Lorna, he said. Yes, Wolfe replied. I suspected, Clive said softly. I suspected, but I hoped. I suppose I wanted it to be Martin. That would have at least made sense. Petty rivalry. Spite. She believed, Wolfe said, that the destruction would force you to create something new, to stop curating and start composing. Clive laughed once, bitterly. She always wanted me to write my own cookbook. Thought I was too obsessed with the past. She was wrong, Wolfe said. The past is not an obsession, it is a root. Clive blinked. That's almost kind. No, Wolfe said. It is accurate. Clive looked down. Do you think she's sorry? No, Wolfe replied. She's satisfied, but that will fade. And when it does, she will discover that her gesture changed nothing but your perception of her. She didn't even read the recipe, Clive whispered. She swallowed it whole. He didn't say thank you, not in words. But he looked at Wolfe with something heavier, older than gratitude, something like shared understanding. Then he turned and left. When the door shut behind him, Wolfe grunted. That man, he said, will either mourn for a week or write something worth preserving. You think he'll finally do it? I think, Wolfe said, that losing something sacred may make him realize what he still possesses. Not often you get poetic. He raised an eyebrow. Phooey. Later, as I made a last round to shut windows and check locks, I found something on the hall table. Small, square, and wrapped in plain brown paper. It hadn't been there earlier. I brought it into the office. Wolfe opened it without comment. Inside was a folded sheet of ivory parchment. Not the Escoffier original. It was gone for good, but something new. Wolfe unfolded it. The ink was dark, handwritten, careful. At the top, in calligraphic strokes, Velouté Garbour, reconstruction in memory. Below, Clive's own version. Adjusted, detailed, original. No note, just the recipe. Wolfe studied it for a long moment. Then he placed it carefully in the drawer beneath his desk, where he kept the rarest menus and the letters he never answered. He didn't smile, but he did nod. Once. And just like that, the brownstone breathed again. No further commentary was needed. Justice, after all, comes in many forms. Sometimes it's a confrontation, sometimes a quiet exile, and sometimes it's simply the restoration of order, one handwritten line at a time. The next morning, Wolfe did not emerge for breakfast. That in itself wasn't a sign of apocalypse. He often spent his early hours in the plant rooms, but Fritz's report that he had declined his usual soft-boiled eggs and coffee raised an eyebrow. Wolfe skipping a meal wasn't unheard of, but it was always deliberate. It meant he was thinking. Not brooding exactly. Wolfe doesn't brood, but digesting something less tangible than Fritz's cooking. I gave him space. There was paperwork to do. Real this time, not just the usual dance of receipts and my witty margin notes, and a report to draft for Mr. Baird, who, to his credit, had already sent a brief wire expressing appreciation. No emotion, just understood. Message received. C.B. Wolfe probably appreciated the brevity, but around 11, the doorbell rang again. And this time, it wasn't Clive or a delivery. It was Saul Panzer. He stepped into the front hallway, brushed off a few rain flecks from his lapel, and nodded to me. "Got something," he said. "Not urgent, but strange." I waved him in. Wolfe was in the office, finally seated at his desk with the gastronomical Me by M.F.K. Fisher open beside him, eyes half-lidded in the glow of his desk lamp. He didn't look up when we entered. "Report," he said. Saul handed over a manila envelope. "This came to me last night," he said. "Dropped through the mail slot at my place. No name, just said, 'For Mr. Wolfe's understanding.'" Wolfe opened it. Inside were 3 photographs. Black and white, grainy but sharp enough to make out what mattered. The first, Clive's library, taken from the hallway just as Wolfe had imagined it. Door ajar, lights low, recipe case still visible. The second, a close-up of a hand, female we guessed by the ring and the polish, holding the folded parchment in front of a gas burner. Not yet burning, just held like a threat. The third, ashes in the fireplace, already curled and half white, with a linen napkin crumpled in the corner. Wolfe stared at them. Not with surprise, he'd already deduced the sequence, but with something more detached, almost academic. "These were taken during the act," he said. "Looks like it." I frowned. Why would someone photograph the crime and send it to Saul? Wolfe tapped a finger once. Then again, because someone knew the real audience wasn't Clive. I blinked. "You mean these weren't just evidence? They were documentation," Wolfe finished. "Proof of concept, a confession disguised as art." Miss Creel, despite her performance at the office, still wanted the last word. But she already got caught. Wolfe nodded slowly. And she was prepared for that. She wanted to be caught, but she also wanted the narrative. Saul cleared his throat. "There's more. I ran a background on her publisher. Turns out Miss Creel had pitched a new memoir 2 weeks before the dinner. Working title, Acts of Devouring. The proposal included an outline, chapters named after culinary transgressions, each based on a real event. Wolfe didn't move. Saul added, Chapter 1 was called The Inedible Recipe. I let out a low whistle. So the whole thing was premeditated publication. Not merely that, Wolfe said. It was legacy theft. She knew Clive's recipe would never be hers, so she consumed it, not just to erase it, but to write over it, to take ownership of the story. That's twisted. No, Wolfe said. It's logical. Repulsive, but logical. He placed the photos gently back in the envelope and pushed them aside. Doesn't require pursuit, he added. Let her publish. Let her confess. She will convict herself in her own prose. And Clive? He has his version now, Wolfe said. Written, revised, and gifted. That is the counterweight. Let it rest. Saul nodded once and left, coat folded over his arm, mind already moving to the next case. I stayed, letting the silence settle again. Wolfe finally looked up from his desk. There's an ancient Roman term, he said, damnatio memoriae. The condemnation of memory. To destroy a name, an image, a legacy, so thoroughly that nothing remains. Fitting, I said, only in this case it didn't work. No, Wolfe agreed, because the response was preservation, the counterbalance of remembrance. Mr. Baird's gesture ensured that. You respect him. I respect his restraint, Wolfe said. He did not retaliate. He restored. I leaned back in the chair and studied him. You think this'll happen again? Not with recipes, he said, but yes. There will always be those who destroy in order to be noticed. It is the currency of the insecure. And you? I prefer obscurity with integrity, Wolfe said, and then reached for his beer. That, finally, felt like the end of the case. We resumed the day's rhythm. The shuffle of books, the quiet murmur of Fritz in the kitchen, the first draft of Wolfe's response to Gourmet Monthly's offensive editorial on canned sauces. Things returned to normal, or as close to it as we ever got. That evening, a new envelope arrived. No name, no address. Inside, a copy of Swallowed Secrets, advance proof, hot off the press. On the title page in red ink, a single line. For the man who understood the metaphor but refused to be devoured by it. Wolfe read it, said nothing. Then he stood, walked to the fire, and without ceremony dropped the book into the flames. This time, no photographs were taken, and nothing smelled of lemon oil. The book burned clean, no fanfare. Wolfe didn't watch it curl or smolder, didn't even glance toward the hearth once the cover caught. He simply returned to his chair, settled back into his bulk, and closed his eyes. It was, in his way, a benediction. No ceremony, no rage, just deliberate erasure. Not to match Creel's theatrics, but to nullify them. I didn't speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't feel like commentary on something Wolfe had already settled. But as I stood there, watching the last ember vanish, I realized something hadn't quite settled in me. Because if the case was truly over, if the balance had been restored, why did it still feel like we'd missed a line in the script? That feeling clung through the next day. Wolfe resumed his routine, orchids from 9 to 11, reading through his stack of cookbooks afterward, but he remained quieter than usual. Even his snorts of disdain toward a new article in Modern Table came late and half-hearted. Around midday, Fritz entered with a letter on a silver tray. Thick stock, handwritten envelope, no postage, dropped off by hand. Wolfe took it without expression and slit the envelope open with his usual letter knife. He read it once, then again, slower. Then he handed it to me. The letter was written in precise black ink, in a looping, old-fashioned hand that took its time on every curve. Dear Mr. Wolfe, you will no doubt have already concluded what I now confirm. Lorna Creel was not the sole architect of the event. Though she planned it, executed it, and gleefully fed upon its symbolism, she did not act alone. She was, in fact, quite insistent on that point, that a true performance required both an audience and a stagehand. I was that stagehand. She told me what she intended to do with the recipe. She asked me to ensure she had time alone in the library during dessert. I created the distraction, the wine mix-up, that prompted Baird to leave the table briefly. While he was gone, she retrieved the recipe and slipped it into her bag. I pretended not to notice. That was my part. I did not know she would later send photographs. I did not know she would use your name in her dedication. That is where my patience ended. I am confessing now not to vindicate her, but to reclaim my silence. I cannot abide being remembered as a prop in someone else's narrative. Burn this if you wish. Or don't. But now you know. Mighty Wolfe didn't move as I lowered the letter. Yvonne, I said. She helped Creel pull it off. He nodded once. Yes. And didn't tell us during the interviews. She told us everything but, Wolfe said. Every word she spoke was crafted to absolve her of the very act she'd already facilitated. But why admit it now? Because Creel overstepped. She made herself the sole author of the event. She erased the rest of the cast. Miss Tyler may be cold, but she is not inconsequential. She would not tolerate being cut from her own performance. So she turned on her partner in crime? Not quite. She turned on the narrative. I sat, eyes still on the letter. Do we tell Clive? Wolfe opened his eyes, looked at me calmly. Number, he has what he needs. Adding another villain will only dilute the clarity. You're letting her walk? She has walked, Wolfe said, and she left her shadow behind. Let her live with it. That should have been the end. But it wasn't, because just before dinner, Veal kidney ragout with wild mushrooms, Fritz's way of grounding the household. Another envelope arrived. This one thinner, glossier, a press kit of all things. Inside, the official announcement of Lorna Creel's new podcast, Swallowed Secrets, the audio series. The tagline, printed in gold foil, because some stories taste better when whispered. The first episode, The Man Who Burned My Book. I showed it to Wolfe. He read it. Then, for the first time in 2 days, he laughed. A quiet sound, short, dry, but unmistakable. "Let her whisper," he said. "The more she narrates, the more she reveals. Won't that bother you?" "Number it amuses me." He leaned back in his chair, hands steepled. "Archie," he said, "do you know the problem with people who consume everything for attention? They eventually run out of things to eat." "No," Wolfe said. "They forget that some things, when digested, become part of you. You cannot remove them. You cannot escape their weight. And you think that applies to Creel? She can write all the stories she likes, but she will always carry the aftertaste." We dined without interruption that night. The brownstone was quiet again. Not empty, never that, but whole. And in a world where some people eat, meaning to feel powerful, I found it comforting to sit across from a man who preserved it simply by refusing to chew. Let the world broadcast its dramas. We had veal, silence, and a final word that needed no audience. The veal had gone, the plates cleared, and Fritz retreated like a priest after a quiet mass. Wolfe sipped his beer in contemplative rhythm, the podcast announcement now folded neatly beneath a coaster, as if to deprive it of breath. We didn't speak of it again that night, not because it wasn't worth a remark, but because Wolfe had already said what mattered. Once a subject is concluded in his mind, dragging it back out for commentary is like reserving a finished course, distasteful. But I wasn't Wolfe, and something still tugged at me. Not dramatic like a murder left unsolved, but faint and persistent, like a misplaced glove that keeps showing up in your dreams. The case was closed. Or it should have been. Lorna's performance was finished, her book burned, her podcast whispering into the void for those who still mistook digestion for dialogue. Yvonne had confessed her part and receded into a silence more damning than any trial. Clive had rewritten the recipe, restored its dignity, and sent it here as if the brownstone were some sort of reliquary for wounded truths. But what gnawed at me wasn't Lorna or Yvonne or even Clive. It was Wolfe. Because in all my years with him, I'd seen him furious, exasperated, triumphant, and gloriously smug. But I had never seen him quiet for so long after a victory. Not like this. Not lingering like a man chewing on a flavor he couldn't identify. So when morning came, and he didn't call me in for orchid scheduling or the usual round of catalog dissection, I did what Archie Goodwin rarely does. I knocked on the plant room door twice. The second knock earned me a yes, flat and uncurious. I entered to find him seated in the south alcove, a towel draped across his knees, a magnifying glass suspended over a rare Vanda hybrid, his eyes sharp but distant. "I hate to interrupt a romantic moment," I said, "but something still doesn't sit right." Wolfe didn't glance up. "That is a physiological matter. Consult a physician." "Ha," I said. "I'm serious." He grunted. "I've been thinking about those photographs Lorna sent Saul," I went on. "They were staged, clearly, but the angle, the timing, hell, even the lighting, it was too perfect. Miss Creel was a dramatist. Yes, but she wasn't a technician. The shots weren't taken on a phone. They were developed, framed. They had intent." Wolfe looked up now, slow and deliberate. "You suspect she had help. I suspect she didn't just have help. I suspect she hired help." Wolfe folded the towel neatly and stood. "Continue." I went back through the list of guests. 5 suspects, sure, but we never looked beyond them. We assumed the theater was internal. What if someone else was involved? Someone who came to the house not to dine but to document? Wolfe was already walking back toward the office. You believe the photographs were taken by a professional? Yes, and not just someone convenient. Someone chosen. He sank into his chair, fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. And that someone had to be in the house. Lorna never left the table, not officially. But she couldn't have taken those pictures and eaten the recipe at the same time, and she sure as hell didn't balance a tripod while seasoning parchment with lemon oil. Wolfe's brow creased. Then who? That, I said, pulling a folded page from my notebook, is where it gets interesting. I placed it on his desk. A background check. One I'd ordered quietly, out of pure itch. On Bradley Kind. Clive's nephew. Yeah, except Bradley's not really. Clive's nephew. He's Clive's step-nephew by a short-lived second marriage to a woman named Isla Damon. A woman who, I might add, once managed a PR firm called Bright Frame Media. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. She specialized in high-visibility branding for lifestyle influencers, photographers, food stylists, image crafters. Guess who her former assistant was? Wolfe didn't answer. Alina Sharp, I said. Freelance photographer, now works under the name Alice Sharp Studio. And guess who posted a teaser image last week on a locked Instagram profile with the caption, Art Eats Memory? Wolfe leaned back, silent for a long moment. So Lorna didn't act alone, nor did Yvonne. They brought in Bradley to orchestrate the visual record. Exactly, I said. He supplied the photographer, arranged the timing, and maybe even tipped Lorna off to how Clive would react. He knows Clive's rhythms. The live stream? That wasn't just fluff, it was an alibi. A digital smokescreen. Wolfe steepled his fingers. Why confess nothing? Because he didn't want credit. Not publicly. He wanted the content. Wolfe nodded once, the gesture cold and exact. The podcast, he said. The teaser trailer includes visuals, clips, photographs, abstract overlays. Lorna's voice narrating. But the structure, the pacing, that's a brand rollout, not a memoir. He intends to monetize the spectacle, Wolfe said, his voice dropping an octave, and to erase himself from the authorship, just like Yvonne, just like Lorna did to her. It's a chain of devourers. Wolfe stood suddenly. Get Saul. Already called. He's on his way. An hour later, Saul arrived, trench coat still damp from the drizzle. He listened to the details without interrupting, eyes tightening as I showed him the background links, the cross-referenced accounts, the time-stamped media files. When I finished, he tapped once on the desk. I can get into the back end, he said. They're hosting the podcast on a shell site. That usually means there's something buried. Find it, Wolfe said. Find the production chain. And confirm whether Mr. Kind arranged the photos. Saul nodded. And then? Then, Wolfe said, voice glacial. We reclaim the narrative. Saul left. I turned to Wolfe. What does that mean exactly? He looked at me, eyes sharp and calm. It means that Miss Creel attempted to perform a crime into meaning. Miss Tyler enabled it for pride, but Mr. Kind attempted to commodify it. He walked to the fire, stared at the ashes where the book had burned. That, he said, I will not abide. Outside, the rain thickened. Inside the brownstone, something shifted. Not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. The curtain had not dropped. Not yet. The rain tapped steadily against the windows, a soft rhythm like fingers drumming on a countertop. Wolfe was back in his chair, his presence filling the room like steam in a locked kitchen. He didn't speak, didn't move, but I knew what was happening behind that stillness. He was calculating, mapping the angles of an offense not yet fully acknowledged, because this time the crime hadn't ended with the culprit's name. It was still mutating, still whispering through uploads and scheduled rollouts. At 11:15, Saul returned, coat folded over one arm, a small portable drive in his hand. "Got it," he said. Their production server was hidden behind a vanity domain registered in Estonia, but the back-end files weren't encrypted. Idiots. Wolfe gestured for the drive. Saul handed it over and took a seat, already opening his notebook. "Tell us," Wolfe said. Saul flipped to a marked page. "There are 7 unreleased episodes in production. Each one has a title, a corresponding folder, and a set of preloaded assets. Images, audio, press quotes, and something called amplifier packages." "Explain." "Custom bundles for social media partners. Basically a press bomb. Clips, hashtags, choreographed tweets, influencer blurbs, you name it. They're trying to stage a micro-viral event with each episode." Wolfe's mouth twisted. "Merchandising confession." "Exactly, and it gets worse. In episode 3, there's a reference to the old man who tried to burn the truth." I glanced at Wolfe. "That's you." "It's not subtle," Saul added. "The attached image is a colorized illustration of this room. Same window, same chair. Wolfe rendered in ink, eyes closed, firelight behind him. Caption: Extinguishing fire doesn't erase the recipe." My jaw clenched. Wolfe's eyes narrowed but remained unreadable. "They're repackaging the entire case," I said, "as performance art. Turning everything into a serialized truth drama." "Truth," Wolfe echoed coldly, "is the currency most easily counterfeited." I looked at Saul. "Is Bradley officially listed as producer?" "Number, but he's all over the metadata. File owner, folder author, source of half the media clips, and he used his stepmother's old business name as the shell company. Bright Frame Reborn." Wolfe sat very still. "He intends to hide behind the mask of strategy. Let Miss Creel carry the dramatic burden while he maintains the revenue stream." "He's smart," I said. "Too smart. He knew we'd catch Lorna, knew Yvonne might crack, but he made sure to keep his fingerprints off everything public." Saul nodded. "And now the first episode drops tomorrow. The whole thing's scheduled to hit at noon Eastern across 5 podcast platforms. Preloaded press packages go out at 11:50. He timed it to dominate the noon cycle," I muttered. "Clive will see it. Everyone involved will be exposed again." "No," Wolfe said. "They will be reframed, transformed from actors into characters. Their motives bent for narrative. Their truths rewritten." I could see his mood shift then. Not anger, precision. It was like watching a chess master pick up the piece he hadn't needed, until now. "Archie," he said, "you will prepare a letter." "To whom?" "To Miss Creel. It will be short, sharp, and it will say the following. Write this exactly. Miss Creel, it seems your appetite for performance exceeds even your capacity for shame. Do not mistake my silence for permission. Withdraw your release by tonight, or I will make public the full chain of complicity, including your photographer, your financier, and the staged documentation you pretended was spontaneous. Consider this your final course." Nero Wolfe. I wrote it down. He continued. "You will send that by registered courier, hand-delivered, not email, not text, understood. To Mr. Kind," he added, "you will deliver a package. Inside it, the photos he commissioned, the metadata Saul recovered, and a single-page summary of the hosting contract under the name Bright Frame Reborn. Include a note." I waited. He dictated, "Mr. Kind, your cleverness has outpaced your discretion. I suggest you halt the podcast release immediately. If you do not, your investors and clients will receive a detailed report of your covert operations and commercial exploitation of a criminal act. There will be no second warning. Nero Wolfe." When I finished transcribing, Wolfe leaned back, hands clasped loosely over his stomach. "Saul," he said, You will monitor their servers until midnight. If they take the episodes down, notify me. If not, prepare to contact the appropriate publications. I will not allow them to narrate over the truth. Done. Saul stood, nodded once, and left. I glanced at the fire. Bare now, dark with spent wood. This feels different, I said. This isn't justice. This is preservation. Wolfe met my gaze. Justice is the restoration of truth, he said. Preservation is its defense. I nodded slowly. You're drawing the line. He closed his eyes. No, Archie. I'm making it visible. That evening, the brownstone was quieter than usual. Wolfe refused dinner, again, and spent 2 hours revisiting a file on culinary hoaxes from the 19th century. I didn't interrupt. At 11:42 p.m., a message arrived from Saul. All scheduled podcast content removed from server, redirected to under revision page. No public explanation posted yet. At 11:59, a second message. Bradley Kine's hosting account deleted. Backup folders emptied. Domain ownership transferred back to Brightframe LLC. Paper trail ends there. At midnight, Wolfe opened a new bottle of beer, poured it slowly, and finally exhaled. I raised my glass. To victory? No, Wolfe said. He looked toward the darkened fireplace, the faint reflection of the room caught in its glass. To integrity. And we drank, not in celebration, in remembrance. The next morning came with the kind of light that doesn't trust the day, gray, low, and a little damp, as if the weather had taken a cue from the tone of our recent victories. Wolfe remained upstairs longer than usual, leaving Fritz and me to the quiet business of breakfast and updates. I didn't need to see him yet. The look in his eye the night before, when he'd toasted to integrity and not triumph, told me everything I needed to know. He hadn't won. He'd simply prevented something worse. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this one, this performance-turned-parasite, had gotten closer to something that shook him more than usual. Wolfe could handle liars, manipulators, even murderers. But being transformed into a character against his will, that was a different offense entirely. By 10:30, I was in the office, clearing a stack of unfiled correspondence, when the doorbell rang. Fritz answered. A moment later, he appeared with a card between his fingers. She insists she has an appointment, he said flatly, but I find no record. I took the card. White, gold script. Marla Devane producer, Narrative 9. Where truth gets its second chance. Podcast studio? I asked. Fritz nodded once. She came alone. That was unusual. People in her business usually traveled in pairs, like badgers or lawsuits. I glanced toward Wolfe's closed door. Let her in. If nothing else, it'll make him hungry. When she entered, she brought the kind of presence that's trained to fill a space without looking like it's trying. Blonde hair coiled neatly, brown leather briefcase, a voice smooth enough to make a blade sound like a compliment. Mr. Goodwin, she said, offering her hand. And this must be the legendary office. Only on good days, I replied. You here to record something or retract it? Neither, she said, and gave me a smile that had won over countless editors. I'm here to offer a proposal. She sat without being asked. Another red flag. Most people wait for Wolfe, but she knew he'd come. I didn't have to call him. He arrived 60 seconds later, as if summoned by the vibration of ambition in the air. He entered, eyes still and slow, and took his seat. You are from Narrative 9, he said. Yes. I'm not interested in being interviewed or interpreted. Good, she said. I'm not here for that. Wolfe arched an eyebrow. I'm here to purchase the rights, she said. To the case, not the details. Those are already public. I want your version, your voice, a one-episode exclusive, you narrating what happened, unfiltered, your terms. The silence in the room went stiller than usual. Even the radiator seemed to pause. Wolfe leaned back. "My terms," he repeated. "Yes, you offer money." "Of course," she said. "And editorial control. Full veto rights. You'll be credited as co-producer. It'll be your story. No edits without your approval. This is your opportunity to control the narrative, Mr. Wolfe." He looked at her like a man examining an unusually shiny beetle. "You presume I care about controlling narrative." She smiled faintly. "I think you care about precision, about truth not being bent into shape for other people's appetites." "You've read the podcast drafts," he said. "Yes, we were offered them." "And declined?" "We found the tone manipulative, a little self-indulgent." "You mean exploitative?" "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to?" I watched her carefully. She wasn't just here for Wolfe. She was here for something else. An opportunity she thought she could finesse out of a man who usually finessed the world from his chair. "And what," Wolfe said slowly, "makes you think I'd participate in this circus after extinguishing its ringmasters?" She didn't flinch. "Because you understand the value of framing. If they tell the story, it becomes legend. If you tell it, it becomes record." He stared at her. "You believe I fear misinterpretation." "I believe," she said gently, "you've had enough of being turned into a metaphor." That got him. Not visibly, but I could tell. Something in the stillness tightened. "I will not narrate." Understood. "I will not perform." Also understood. "But I will dictate a transcript, a record." She nodded. "We can build around that. No dramatization, no sound design, no music. Only your voice. Or Goodwin's." I blinked. "Me? You narrate my business all the time, Archie. You might as well do it with a microphone." Wolfe looked back to her. "You may have one version. Final. Vetted. And it must include an appendix of the letter Miss Creel sent Mr. Panzer, and the metadata Saul recovered." "Agreed," she said. "We'll make the receipts part of the story." Wolfe closed his eyes. "Then you may proceed. Send over the contract. Archie will review it. If it is grotesque, he will refuse." She stood and extended her hand again. This time Wolfe didn't take it. He merely nodded. As she left, I followed her to the door. "You really think people still care about the truth?" I asked. She paused, hand on the knob. "No," she said, "but they care when the truth embarrasses the lie." And with that, she was gone. Back in the office, I stood in the doorway. "You sure about this?" "No," Wolfe said, "but I am sure that silence in the hands of profiteers becomes permission." I sat across from him, pulled out my notebook. "You ready to tell it?" He nodded once. I uncapped my pen. And Nero Wolfe began to speak. We recorded the story 3 days later. Not in a studio. Not under lights. Wolfe wouldn't have tolerated that, even if the alternative was being misquoted on the radio. Instead, we did it our way. Right there in the office. Me in the red chair, Wolfe in his own, dictating at a steady clip, every sentence as clean and final as a full stop. No script, no rehearsal, just truth, the way Wolfe liked it. Deliberate, cold, and unbending. The whole thing ran just under an hour. 46 minutes of a story Wolfe didn't want to tell but knew had to be told. The facts were laid out plainly: the theft, the performance, the co-conspirators, the shadow producer. No embellishment, no sentiment. Just logic, motive, method. By the time I got to the final paragraph, Wolfe's own words, I paused. He gave me a nod. So I read it aloud, into the quiet. "Some crimes are not punishable by law. They are punishable by memory. And in the memory of this house, Miss Creel's act stands not as innovation, but desecration. Her appetite was not for food, but for attention. And like all hunger divorced from meaning, It left only ashes. Let that be her legacy. We left it there. No outro. No music. Wolfe wouldn't allow a signature on something that spoke for itself. The episode was released the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after Marla's visit. Narrative 9 titled it simply, "The Recipe That Wasn't Eaten." It didn't trend, it didn't go viral. It wasn't clipped and memed and stitched into 15-second circus acts. It was respected. The silence that followed wasn't hollow, it was quiet because people listened. Lorna Creel, for her part, made no public statement. Her podcast page disappeared. Bright Frame Reborn was reabsorbed into the web fog of dead LLCs and orphan domains. Yvonne Tyre went back to academia. Bradley Kine's online presence flickered for a while, then settled into lifestyle posts and sponsored broths. Clive Baird released a small book, Reconstructed Traditions, and never once mentioned the theft inside its pages. And Wolfe? Wolfe went back to his orchids, to his beer, to his endless war against the rise of pre-made sauces. But something lingered. Not bitterness, not even triumph. Just the quiet knowledge that for once he'd stepped in, not to solve a crime, but to protect a truth. And as for me, well, I got to tell it. Not in fiction, not behind someone else's lens, but here, as it happened, word for word, step by step, from a brownstone on West 35th where stories don't get rewritten, only written right.